Hello again. As you know, I am Eli, the computer guy, and today's class is Introduction to Active Directory Services Structure in Windows Server 2012. Try saying that 3 times fast. So basically, today we are going to be doing an overview of what is Active Directory Services, why it is so important in the Windows environment and in corporate network environments, and give you an idea of the overall concepts that you have to understand about them. Now, when we're talking about this, you're probably going to recognize some words that you have heard from certification classes or if you've been studying things on the internet. So we're going to be talking about domains today, we're going to be talking about trees, we're going to be talking about forests, and we're going to be talking about trusts, what all of these things mean. So Active Directory is why Windows servers are so important. Active Directory is, you know how they say that Cisco equipment is what makes the internet work? Well, Windows servers Active Directory is what makes businesses work. This is a very fundamental technology in almost every enterprise, so it's very important that you understand what's going on. Now, I know a lot of you guys, I get all these like little snarky comments talking about, oh, psh, who wants a Windows server? Why would you pay those stupid fees? I'm going to use Linux. And you know what? Using Linux is great if you have some kind of web service. Using Linux is great if you want to set up some Samba file server for an office of 10 or 20 users. But when you start dealing with offices of corporations that have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, the fact of the matter is that Windows Active Directory is about the only thing that will cut it. So what is Active Directory? Active Directory Services, as it is now called, is the server service for security and permissions in a Windows environment. So if you want to set up computers and create security policies for those computers, you would use Active Directory Services. If you want to set up a VPN connection and only allow certain users to be able to connect into the corporate network using that VPN connection, the security, the ability to connect to that will be through Active Directory Services. So basically, Active Directory Services is the pinnacle of what is called single sign-on. So what happens is you sit down at your computer in the enterprise world, you log in once, and all of a sudden all of the network resources are either available to you or are blocked to you from that single sign-on. So you sign on once, you get access to the computer, and you get access to the shared files and folders, and you get access to the shared printers, and if you're allowed, you get access to be able to VPN into the network, and you get access, or not, to SharePoint, and you get your emails. Basically, what Active Directory Services allows is that administrators can sit down and essentially at one console give users and individual computers permissions to do things on the network and do things on individual computers. That is what makes it so powerful. Again, when you're dealing with 10,000 or 100,000 computers, you can't sit down at every single computer and try to configure, you know, the security policies for every single computer. That just won't work. With Active Directory Services, you can create policies within the domain controllers, the servers that control Active Directory Services, and those policies will go out throughout the network and will populate out that way. Active Directory is the only way, really, nowadays that this can happen. The amazing thing, why this is so powerful, is because not only can you do the things that you probably think about, such as you can give users permissions to files and folders, you can give users permissions to a printer, maybe you can give users whether or not they can connect in through a VPN or such, but you can also lock down security policies on computers. So you can say whether or not users are able to change the background image on their computer? Are they able to access the CD drive? Are they able to access control panel? You can use security policies to lock down what users are able to do. Not only that, but you can actually lock down based off on computers. So if you have a corporate environment where you have kiosk computers, so kiosk computers, kiosk systems are computers that kind of sit out in public areas and can be used for public or semi-public purposes. So let's say you have a computer that allows people to find out what offices certain employees are in, or you have a computer that shows, again, some kind of directory. Well, what you'd be worried about is if this computer is in a public place, what happens if somebody trying to be a hacker goes up to the computer and tries to infiltrate your network from that computer? Well, using security policies, what are called group policy objects, you are actually able to secure that computer and say that kiosk computer has access to one very specific file on the network and no others. So if you log into that computer, even as the CEO of the company, you will only be able to access that one single file because everything else has been restricted. So this is what makes Active Directory, directory services, so powerful. Now when I'm talking about Active Directory, and I'm talking about other things in this Windows Server 2012 class, I am going to try to talk to you in the specific verbiage or words that Microsoft wants me to talk to you in. But I will warn you that if you are planning to take a test, make sure you go out and pick up a book to learn all the words that you should learn. So when I learned Active Directory way back when, we called it Active Directory. Now with, I think it was actually Windows Server 2008, Microsoft started calling it Active Directory directory services. Now I know that doesn't seem like a big deal to you right now, but if you sit down at a test, Microsoft gets very specific on the words you use. If you say that security policies and all that are controlled by Active Directory, you might be wrong, whereas if you said Active Directory directory services, you would be correct. So one of the warnings that I will give you, the more we delve into Windows Server 2012, is I will try to use the proper words. I will try, but again, if you're going to be taking the Microsoft test, make sure you go out and buy a book. Like I say, this is my workbook that I'm using, Windows Server 2012 Unleashed by Sam's, costs 60 bucks at Barnes & Noble, but make sure you go out and buy a book and read the book because some of the words that I use may not be absolutely correct. So let's go over to the whiteboard now, and so I can start explaining to you guys really how cool Active Directory is, because it really is just it's an amazing thing, especially if you've ever worked in an environment that doesn't have Active Directory, then you'll realize just how wonderful Active Directory is. So basically, when we are talking about Active Directory, the servers that control Active Directory are called domain controllers, or DCs. So domain controllers or DCs are what control Active Directory services. So just like an Exchange server controls Microsoft email services, or a Samba server is a type of file server, a domain controller is an Active Directory server. The domain controller is what stores all of the information for the user accounts and computer accounts. So basically you start with what is called a DC, or a domain controller. Now within the DC or the domain controller, what you add to the domain controller, or DC, is you add user accounts and you add computer accounts. I think they're called accounts. But basically, you add user accounts and computer accounts into the database for the domain controller. Now, when you add information to that database, you're adding information to what is called the schema. So you will hear the word schema, and it will sound very scary, but don't get scared by the word schema. Schema is simply the database, the scheme, for how data is stored in the domain controller. What information is stored in the domain controller about users and computers and other things. So the schema states that for user accounts, there will be a username, and there will be a password, and there will be an email address, and there might be an office number, and there will be a whole bunch of different pieces of information. The user account schema, the schema holds lots and lots of different data about the user account. Then for the computer account, it will have such as the computer name, it will have, I think it's a SID, it will have the identifier, and it will have other information. So the schema is the scheme, the types of data that are stored for the different user accounts and for the computer accounts. And the schema is in the domain controller and is part of Active Directory directory services. Now, one of the things that makes the schema powerful, what makes this whole Active Directory system powerful, is that the schema is what is called extendable, right? So what extendable means is that in many systems, they will create something for a user account, and let's say a computer account. They'll tell you what data you can add, and then you're done. You can't add any more data than what the original vendor or programmer or manufacturer told you you could add. Well, with the schema, with Active Directory directory services, it is extendable, which means you can actually add more to it. So when you install a domain controller for the first time, there's a certain amount of data that is stored for all users and computers. But then as you go, such as if you install Exchange Server on the network, it will then add the different types of data that can be stored in the schema for the user accounts and the computer accounts. So let's make sure we've got this. So domain controllers are the servers that control Active Directory directory services. The main points in the domain controllers are the user accounts and the computer accounts. So user accounts are you, me, anybody sitting down at the computer. The user accounts is you actually add computers to the domain to make them members of the domain. So computers have their own accounts, and this becomes very important later. So the user accounts and the computer accounts. The types of data that are stored for the user accounts and the computer accounts is in what is called the schema. The schema basically says, like I say, for user accounts, you store the username, password, email address, office, blah, 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 blah. And for computers, you do the computer name, the unique ID, blah, 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 blah. So all these different points of data, just like you would in any kind of user database. The main thing with the schema that makes it so useful is, again, it's extendable. So you can add some type of third-party software, and that third-party software can go into the domain controller and add additional bits of information that it will collect or it will store about the individual user accounts and computer accounts on the network. So now that we're that far, so we understand we've got user accounts and we've got computer accounts on this domain controller. Now here's one of the problems though. Is, again, we're talking about user accounts, and we're talking about computer accounts, and we're talking about networks. We're talking about big networks. We're not talking about hundreds of users. We're not talking about thousands of users and computers. We're talking about tens of thousands of users and computers, or hundreds of thousands of users and computers. Now, one of the big points with this Active Directory directory services is security. So saying who has access to what? Who has access to what file or folder? Who has access to what VPN connection? Who has access to what website, right? Well, if we had to go into every single user account and every single computer account and actually give every single user and computer these rights and permissions, that would take forever. Again, we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users. So for security purposes, we can add users and computers into what are called groups. Groups, what you can then do is you put users into the groups, and then you assign the groups permissions to the different resources on the network. So if you have a file that only the accounting people that are in the accounting department should have access to, so you have this file over here, and only the accounting department should have access to it. Nobody else should have access to it, right? Well, what you do is you put all the members of the accounting group, all the users who are in the accounting department, into an accounting group, and then you give that accounting group permission to the accounting folder. Now they have access into the folder. You can block everybody else from being able to see it. So that makes it a lot easier. If you have an accounting department, again, let's say you have 100 employees, then when somebody gets hired, you simply add them to the accounting group and they get all the rights and permissions that an accounting person should get. If somebody gets fired, you simply take them out of the accounting group, and then that automatically takes away all of those rights and permissions. So the first thing that you need to think about is groups, and groups are used for security. Then, the next thing you do in order to deal with all these people and all of these computers is you have what are called OUs, or organizational, I'm a horrible writer, unit. Organizational units are groups, but they're for administrative purposes. So basically, you can create OUs, or organizational units, for administrative purposes. Now, what does this mean? What are we talking about when we're going to be creating groups for organizational purposes? Well, when you go into the corporate world, what you're going to find out is most employees, when you go in there as an administrator, you can lock them down. You can tell them exactly what they're going to do with their computers, and they just got to do it, right? You're the computer network administrator, and they've got to suck it up and do whatever it is you tell them they can do with the computer. Such as, let's say if you're in a company that has call center employees. Basically, you may have 1,000 call center employees, and you go in there and you can very simply lock those call center employees down to only be able to use, let's say, 2 applications. They're not allowed to get to the internet. They're not allowed to change the background on the screen. They're not allowed to do anything to their computers. They are locked down, and those computers are super secure and super stable and just super, because that's administrators, that's what we like to do. We like to lock things down because that makes our life a lot easier. Well, the problem is like for all those call center people, sad as it is to say, they are incredibly replaceable. If they don't like the fact that their computer is locked down, well, then they get fired, they get replaced by somebody else, and the world goes on. That's how it works in the corporate world. But as I talk about, the reason why you want to be a professional, the reason why you want to be a highly skilled professional, is because when the company hires highly skilled professionals, they don't treat them the same way. Basically, if highly skilled professionals say they want their computer to do X, Y, or Z, they want to be able to install something, they want to be able to change the background image on their computer, well, by golly, they are going to do it, right? If you go to the marketing department, if you walk in as the administrator to a marketing department and you tell them you're going to lock down their computers, they are going to be up in open revolt. Literally, those folks are going to quit the company because they are not going to tolerate being told what to do with their computers. And frankly, the company finds them very valuable, so they don't want them to quit. So the problem comes up is you have these organizational units that need to be dealt with by their own people sometimes. So what you can do with organizational units is you can create, let's say, the marketing department organizational unit, OU, and then you can give one person in the marketing department administrative permissions for that marketing department organizational unit. So he can be like the marketing admin, right? So if software needs to be installed, if things need to be changed, whatever, instead of the marketing department always calling you, because these things need to be done every day, a few times a day, you just don't have time for all the stuff that they need done, what you can do is you can delegate the administrative tasks to a marketing administrator, and then that marketing administrator has permissions over all the computers and user accounts within the marketing organizational unit. So if passwords need to be reset, that marketing administrator will be allowed to do that. If programs need to be installed, you can set it up so for that marketing administrator to be able to do that, so on and so forth. This can be very useful if you have things like remote sites. So, again, back when I was in the corporate world, I had, what did I have? 12 offices I had to deal with, all over the place, all the way from Washington, D.C. to Boston, right? So one of the problems was I was the only guy with the administrative account. And you don't want to give out your password. So if somebody in the Boston office calls you and you're in Baltimore, you don't want to give them your password in order to make a change on the local network. But you also don't want to actually have to grab a flight up to Boston to fix whatever is going on. So again, with these OUs, or this organizational unit, if you have remote offices, you could create a Boston admin organizational unit or administrator who has permission to deal with all the user accounts and computer accounts that are in the Boston office, so that if there are any problems, they can try to fix the problems before you have to grab a flight and actually fly out to Boston. Now, the nice part with the organizational unit is what that means is that Boston administrator has access to whatever you allow him to have in the Boston office, but if he tries to hack into Philadelphia, it won't happen, because he's not allowed to have permissions in the Philadelphia office. So you as an administrator, you are a global, I don't know what they're called anymore. They used to be called global administrators. So you're a global administrator, which means I, as Eli the computer guy, I control all of this. I control all the servers. I can log into Boston, I can log into Philly, I can log into DC, I can log into Syracuse, I can log into Long Island. I am allowed to do all that, right? Because I'm a global administrator. The problem is again, that people do dumb things. You don't want to give a lot of power to any one person unless you have to, because they might damage something. They may do it nefariously, or they might do it just because they're trying to be a good person and they don't realize how much damage they're doing. So for global administrators, for administrators that have control over everything, you want very few of those. But what you can do with these organizational units is, again, the Boston office can have a Boston administrator. The Philadelphia office can have a Philadelphia administrator. The DC office can have a DC administrator. Those administrators can only administer what you give them permission to administer within those particular offices. And that is all set up with the organizational unit. So with the organizational unit, you populate it with whatever computer accounts, so computers on the network that they should be able to access and administrate, and then you add all the user accounts that they're allowed to administrate, and then you say exactly what they're allowed to do, and then they're allowed to do all that work with the organizational unit. Again, as we go on, this stuff will make a lot more sense, but remember, the domain controller is the server that controls the Active Directory services. The domain controller contains user accounts and computer accounts. The information that is stored on these user accounts and computer accounts is based on the schema. You create groups for security purposes, so that you assign rights and permissions to the group, and then you add users and computers to the group to make your life easier. For administrative purposes, you then create these OUs, or organizational units, and then again, you can say one person in the Boston office is allowed to administer the Boston computers. So this is some of the basic concepts of what you need to know for Active Directory services. Now, the next thing that we're going to be talking about, so we have the DC, we have the domain controller, right? We've talked about the domain controller. And then we have the user accounts, and we have the computer accounts. Well, the domain controller then creates what is called a domain, right? So the computers are tied to the domain controller's domain, and the user accounts are tied to the domain controller's domain. So basically, the domain is all the computers and user accounts that are tied to the domain controller's Active Directory services domain. So this is what a domain is. Domains are basically, they're used for administrative purposes. So okay, so we know everybody here is in the EliTheComputerGuy.com domain. So now we need to start talking about domains, trees, forests, and trusts. And this is where things can get a little complicated. So we have this domain here. And so just for this example today, we are going to be talking about Google, because Google is a name you guys probably know, and you can probably follow along with the information about why I'm talking about Google. So let's say we create a domain for google.com, right? So we have google.com. So google.com is Google. Everybody knows what Google is. Google.com is Google. So Google creates their company, they get domain controllers, they add users, they add computers, and they have their domain google.com. And this is essentially, this right here is really what most of you guys are going to be dealing with. You guys are going to be dealing with single domains for the most part. But this is a real class, so I've got to teach you all the rest of this. So in the beginning, we have google.com. Now, as Google grows, right, Google starts expanding into more geographic areas. So Google expands into Asia. Google expands into Europe. Google expands into Africa. Now, one of the problems is that when Google expands into, let's say, Europe has a lot more regulations than the United States has. So Europe may have a requirement about how the security on the domain and certain specific things about how the domain is administered. So again, as I talk to you guys about nowadays, the real technology world is, you know, it has as much to do with laws as it does technology anymore. So you have to be thinking about things like laws. So the thing is so when you go into Europe may have a very specific set of laws and security that you have to deal with for the domain. Now Google.com is sitting in the United States, and they're like, ah, man. You know, we don't want to have to deal with all these security requirements for the rest of the company. You know, if in order to get into Europe, we have to have some improved security, that's fine. But we don't want to have to pay for that improved security over the entire company. So what they will do is they will create a subdomain. So they will create a subdomain, and this subdomain might be Europe.google.com. And this is actually its own domain with its own domain controllers, but it is a subdomain of google.com. Now, the reason that it's a subdomain, that it'll be created as a subdomain of google.com, is because of what we talked about before with the schema. The schema, right, all of the data, the types of data that are stored for a user or for a computer, Google has come up with a very specific schema for their users and for their computers, and they want to make sure that that schema is used throughout all of the company. So what they do is they create this subdomain, Europe.google.com, which uses the schema for Google.com. But otherwise, they can lock it down and they can make it more secure. Then let's say they go over here and they're going into Africa, so they create Africa.google.com. So these domains, again, have their own domain controllers, they have their own user accounts, they have their own computer accounts, and so on. So domain controller, user, computer, using the same schema. Now, one of the reasons why this is a very useful structure is because then we have something called two-way implicit trusts, transitive trusts. So, when we create a subdomain from another domain, so google.com, and we're creating europe.google.com, we create what is called a two-way implicit transitive trust. So let's just break this down for a second. So what we're talking about two ways. We're talking about Google and Europe.google.com both what is called trust each other. We'll talk about what trust is in a second. We also, when we create the sub domain of Africa.google.com, that also creates the implicit two-way transitive trusts. So Europe.google.com trusts Google.com, Google.com trusts Europe.google.com. Then we create the subdomain Africa, Africa.google.com trusts Google.com, and Google.com trusts Africa.google.com. So that's two-way trust, but then it's transitive. What transitive means is if Europe.google.com trusts Google.com, it also will then trust Africa.google.com. So transitive means any subdomain created here will trust the other domains. Now you're thinking, okay, Eli, what does it mean to trust another domain? Why is this important? Why this is important is that means you can give user accounts. So if you're down at Europe.google.com, you could create permissions for users from Google.com. So if I am, let's say I'm somebody from the corporate marketing department up here at Google.com, and they want me to send me to Europe so I can fix some big mess, right? Well, the cool thing with Active Directory is without Active Directory, basically down here at Europe.google.com, they would have to create new user accounts, they'd have to create a new computer account, they would have to do a lot of work, they'd have to do a lot of effort. Well, because there's a trust here, what you can do is you can actually just give permissions to user accounts from Google.com. So if I have to go down into Europe.google.com, they can simply give me permission. So they can add my user account from Google.com to, let's say, the marketing department at Europe.google.com, and now I'm able to access all the files and folders, permissions, and security that I need. So that is what the trust relationship means. The transitive trust means that I could also, if I had a user at Europe.google.com, they could go over to Africa.google.com, and Africa.google.com could give my user account from Europe.google.com permission to resources on their particular domain. So this is what the trusts are, and this is why it's so useful, is because you can go into a different domain and using your same username and your same password, that the administrators on that domain can give you permissions to do stuff on that particular domain. So I know this may seem like, but it really is important in the real world. Now, why we're using Google is to explain to you how this continues to expand out. And again, why Active Directory, directory services is so important, and why if you're like, I would never use that, well, what you're saying is you really never want to work in the real enterprise world. So here is the domain. So this is Google.com. And then under it, we have these subdomains, Europe.com, and Europe.google.com and Africa.google.com, right? So we have the Google.com and then the subdomains. Well, when we start talking about trees and forests, this is a tree. It kind of looks like a tree. Kind of looks like a Christmas tree, right? So one of these units, one of these domains is the domain. When you create subdomains from the original domain, that is what is called a tree. So a tree is when you add subdomains to the original domains. That is what a tree is. Now, when you create a forest, what happens is, since we're using Google, and this is why we're using Google, let's say, Motorola is over here, right? And this is the Motorola.com domain. And it has subdomains of, let's say, us.motorola.com and, I don't know, asia.motorola.com. So we have the Google.com tree, and then we have the Motorola.com tree. So now these are entirely different trees, which means the schema is different. The schema is different. The different types of information that are being collected and used for the user and computer accounts are different because basically they're two entirely different companies. Again, why we're talking about Google. You have Google.com, you have Motorola.com. They're entirely different companies. They're doing their own thing. Google does search, Motorola does hardware. They have nothing to do with each other, all the way up until when Google buys Motorola, and now they become one company, right? Now, when we're dealing with again, big companies, tens of thousands of users, this could become a problem because Google needs to send lots of their people over to Motorola in order to do work. But Motorola is a different company under an entirely different domain. So what would normally have to happen is you'd have to create new computer accounts, new user accounts, add them into the whole mess, and then it's just annoying because then the Google employee has Google credentials and they have Motorola credentials. It just becomes tedious. Well, what you can do is you can start creating what are called explicit one-way trusts. So what we can do is we can have Motorola.com, when Motorola.com gets bought by Google.com, the administrators for Motorola.com can create a one-way explicit trust to Google.com. What that means is as soon as they create that trust relationship, they can then give user accounts from Google.com permission to do stuff on the Motorola network. So you can have, let's say, Google.com/Bob is a user account, and you can give Google.com/Bob permissions to files and folders now on the Motorola network. You don't have to create new user accounts, you don't have to do anything. You simply take that user account and you put it into a group as we talked about before, and now they have access to all the files and folders, permissions, and resources. So again, we talk about those marketing people. So Google.com sends a number of marketing people over to Motorola.com's marketing department to try to knit the departments together. Well, now the people that came over from Google.com, those user accounts can simply be added to the marketing department group in the Motorola.com domain, and now they can use all of the resources that they would before. So when you're doing this, when we're connecting different domains, you do one-way explicit trust. Basically, what the explicit means is you actually have to create this connection, and then when you create it, it only goes one way. So what you can do is you can have Motorola trust Google, but Google can say, man, we don't know about these Motorola folk. It's one way. We don't know if we want Motorola people coming into our corporate headquarters. We bought Motorola, so you're darn tootin'. Our people will be going to Motorola and doing work. But we don't know if we want Motorola employees coming over to our headquarters and doing work. So it's one way. So you can have it so Motorola.com trusts Google, but you can leave it at that. Google does not trust Motorola. If you wanted to make this a two-way, you then add the trust from Google to Motorola. Again, it's still one way, but basically you would have two one-way trusts. Google would then trust Motorola, Motorola would trust Google, so on and so forth. Then with transitive trusts, if Google trusts Motorola, Europe.google.com trusts Google, then what you can do is you can have a user account from Europe.google.com go over to Asia.motorola.com and then be able to do work there. So it's all about very easily being able to give users and computers permissions, security, so on and so forth within this Active Directory Services environment. And this is what we call a forest. So we have the Google.com tree here, the Motorola.com tree here. When we connect these with trusts, then this becomes a forest. So, you know, there's that Kansas City fiber thing that Google is doing. So let's say kansascity.fiber.com. And that's its own domain with its own sub things. So we create trust here, and that just expands the forest. So that is what we're talking about with domains, trees, and forests. When you create a subdomain, that automatically creates a two-way transitive trust, which means somebody from Europe.com can also do things over at Africa.com if they're given permission. When you connect trees together, it's one-way implicit trust, so you can have it so Motorola trusts Google, but Google does not trust Motorola, or you can have it going both ways. But then when we add those domains together, that becomes forests. So that is the basic overall concept of what we're talking about when we're talking about the Active Directory directory services structure and why it becomes so powerful. That essentially you can take some user at a Europe.google.com, you can add them to a group over on Asia.motorola.com, and then they can sit down at a computer and then they have access to printers and folders and email and everything that they need access to. They don't need numerous accounts, they don't need numerous passwords, they don't need numerous all that kind of stuff. Basically the administrator just adds them to the account if these trusts have been set up, and they're good to go. So these are the very important things that you have to understand about Active Directory directory services in order to really go forward and understand the power of the Windows servers. If you take Active Directory away from Windows servers, then yeah, frankly, Linux and Unix do a lot of things better than Microsoft. I'm not even going to argue with you about that. But the power of Active Directory means that for these enterprise worlds, these corporate worlds, when you're talking about Motorola's, you're talking about Google's, you're talking about Exxon's, you're talking about these major corporations, Active Directory just does something that no other service does. So the servers that do Active Directory directory services are called domain controllers. They contain user and computer accounts. The information that is stored about those user or computer accounts is based on the schema. The schema is extendable, which means you can add bits of information that you want the schema to store. And then as we go into forests and trees and trusts that I've already repeated 3 times, I think you understand what's going on. So let me go back over to my little desk over here so we can wrap up. So that is what you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about Active Directory. Again, one of the biggest problems with most people that go for their MCSEs or their MCSAs is, frankly, they have never worked or been involved in a computer or technology environment large enough for any of this to make sense, you know? I mean, if you haven't been in a position to be in a company where you see the tens of thousands of employees or the hundreds of thousands of employees and be responsible for any component of that, you may not really realize why Active Directory is so valuable. You know, even if you are in a very large company, you may be in a department of 20 people or 10 people or 100 people, and you don't understand the administrative headache of having to deal with tens of thousands of users, of having to deal with corporations that buy other corporations. So again, the question is if your corporation buys a different corporation and you're a tech, all of a sudden your boss is going to be sending you over to that company that you just bought to start doing technical work, you know, to start aligning their technology with what your company uses. Well, if you go there, makes life a lot easier if you can simply use the same user account that you've been using for the past 5 years at the company you're with. You can just go there, you can log in under your own credentials, you're given permissions, and you can go about your day. You get your email, you can use SharePoint, now you can use Skype. All of that stuff is just a single sign-on. You don't have any additional problems. Whereas if you didn't have these trust relationships, if they sent you over, let's say, to Motorola.com, they would have to create a new user account for you. They'd have to create a new computer account for you. They'd have to create a new email address for you. They'd have to create all of this additional information. So now you have your original company's user account and a profile and all that, plus the company you're at, this new company you're at, user account and profile. And then if they have you running around between like multiple different companies that the parent company may own, it can just become a mess. All of a sudden you've got like 5 different accounts, passwords to remember, It's just like I say, if you've done this stuff in the real world, it just becomes an absolute and utter nightmare. So this is the overall concept for Active Directory directory services. Again, I kept saying Active Directory directory services because that is now what Microsoft says you should remember. So if you see that in a test, remember this is Active Directory directory services. As we go forward in this Windows Server 2012 track, again, I am going to try to use the proper words that Microsoft wants me to use, but just realize, again, I'm a professional technician. I don't take certification tests all the time, so I might use some incorrect words. If you are going to be taking the certification tests, make sure you pick up certification study books to make sure, you know, I say the right word. You know the right words that we're talking about. So this was the latest class in the Windows Server 2012 track. We're going to be having a lot more. So the next one, we're going to be talking about the infrastructure involved with Active Directory directory services. We're going to talk more about the domain controllers, clustering domain controllers, sites, basically how all of this stuff gets built out. But you need to understand what domains are. You need to understand what trees are. You need to understand what forests are, what user accounts, computer accounts, groups, and organizational units. If you don't understand that basic terminology, everything else is going to get really confusing really fast. So if you didn't understand how I talked about it, again, go to Google or grab a book and sit down and make sure you understand what these concepts are, because if you don't, it's all going to turn into a mess, as I said. So as you know, I'm Eli the Computer Guy. This class was Introduction to Active Directory Directory Services Structure in Windows Server 2012. As always, I enjoy teaching this class and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.